Hello, hello. This is Morel Bernard with the continuation of the story, David Copperfield. Last words with David Copperfield's story was that we all acknowledge that we felt this something of a disappointment, but Mrs. Gummidge said she felt it more than we did, and shed tears again, and made that former declaration with great bitterness. And by the way, please subscribe to Study Coach UK channel. Please subscribe and please share. Tell others about Study Coach UK storytelling. Thank you very much. Okay, let me continue with the story of David Copperfield. Accordingly, when Mr. Peggotty came home about 9 o'clock, this unfortunate Mrs. Gummidge was knitting in her corner, in a very wretched and miserable condition. Peggotty had been working cheerfully. Ham had been patching up a great pair of water boots, and I, with little Emily by my side, had been reading to them. Mrs. Gummidge had never made any other remark than a forlorn sigh, and had never raised her eyes since tea. "Well, mates," said Mr. Peggotty, taking his seat, "and how are you?" We all said something or looked something to welcome him, except Mrs. Gummidge, who only shook her head over her knitting. "Oh, what's amiss?" said Mr. Peggotty with a clap of his hands. "Cheer up, old mother." Mr. Peggotty meant old girl. Mrs. Gummidge did not appear to be able to cheer up. She took out an old black silk handkerchief and wiped her eyes. But instead of putting it in her pocket, kept it out and wiped them again, and still kept it out, ready for use. "What's amiss, dame?" said Mr. Peggotty. "Nothing," returned Mrs. Gummidge. "You've come from the Willing Mind, don't I?" "Why, yes. I took a short spell at the Willing Mind tonight," said Mr. Peggotty. "I'm sorry I should drive you there," said Mrs. Gummidge. "Drive? I don't want no driving," returned Mr. Peggotty with an honest laugh. "I only go too ready." "Very ready," said Mrs. Gummidge, shaking her head and wiping her eyes. Yes, very ready. I am sorry it should be along of me that you're so ready." "Along of you? It ain't along o' you," said Mr. Peggotty. "Don't you believe a bit on it." Yes, it is," cried Mrs. Gummidge. "I know what I am. I know that I am a lone, lorn creature, and not only that everything goes contrary with me, but that I go contrary with everybody. Yes, I feel more than other people do, and I show it more. It's my misfortune." I really couldn't help thinking as I sat in all this, that the misfortune extended to some other members of that family beside Mrs. Gummidge. But Mr. Peggotty made no such retort, only answering with another entreaty to Mrs. Gummidge to cheer up. "I ain't what I could wish myself to be," said Mrs. Gummidge. "I'm far from it. I know what I am. My troubles has made me contrary. I feel my troubles, and they make me contrary. I wish I didn't feel 'em, but I do. I wish I could be hardened to 'em, but I ain't. I make the house uncomfortable. I don't wonder at it. I've made your sister so all day, And Master Davy? Here I was suddenly melted and roared out, "No, no, you haven't, Mrs. Gummidge," in great mental distress. "Oh, it's far from right that I should do it," said Mrs. Gummidge. "It ain't a fit return. I'd better go into the house and die. I'm a lone creature, and I'd much better not make myself contrary here. If things must go contrary with me, then I must go contrary myself. Let me go contrary in my parish, then I'd better go into the house and die and be a riddance." Mrs. Gummidge retired with these words and betook herself to bed. When she was gone, Mr. Peggotty, who had not exhibited a trace of any feeling but the profoundest sympathy, looked round upon us, and nodding his head with a lively expression of that sentiment still animating his face, said in a whisper, "She's been thinking of the old one." I did not quite understand what old one Mrs. Gummidge was supposed to have been fixed her mind upon, until Peggotty, on seeing me to bed, explained that it was the late Mr. Gummidge, and that her brother always took that for a received truth on such occasions, and that it always had a moving effect upon him. Some time after he was in his hammock that night, I heard him myself repeat to Ham, "Poor thing, she's been thinking of the old un." And whenever Mrs. Gummidge was overcome in a similar manner during the remainder of our stay, which happened some few times, he always said the same thing in extenuation of the circumstance, and always with the tenderest commiseration. So the fortnight slipped away, varied by nothing but the variation of the tide, which altered Mr. Peggotty's times of going out and coming in, and altered Ham's engagements also. When the latter was unemployed, he sometimes walked with us to show us the boats and ships, and once or twice he took us for a row. I don't know why one slight set of impressions should be more particularly associated with a place than another, though I believe this obtains, with most people, in reference especially to the associations of their childhood. I never hear the name or read the name of Yarmouth, but I am reminded of a certain Sunday morning on the beach, the bells ringing for church, little Emily leaning on my shoulder, Ham lazily dropping stones into the water, and the sun, away at sea, just breaking through the heavy mist and showing us the ships like their own shadows. At last the day came for going home. I bore up against the separation from Mr. Peggotty and Mrs. Gummidge, but my agony of mind at leaving little Emily was piercing. We went arm in arm to the public house where the carrier put up, and I promised on the road to write to her. I redeemed that promise afterwards in characters larger than those in which apartments are usually announced in manuscripts as being to let. We were greatly overcome at parting, and if ever in my life I have had a void made in my heart, I had one made that day. Now, all the time I'd been on my visit, I had been ungrateful to my home again and had thought little or nothing about it. But I was no sooner turned towards it than my reproachful young conscience seemed to point that way with a ready finger, and I felt all the more for the sinking of my spirits that it was my nest, and that my mother was my comforter and friend. This gained upon me as we went along, so that the nearer we drew, the more familiar the objects became that we passed, the more excited I was to get there and to run into her arms. But Peggotty, instead of sharing in those transport, tried to check them, though very kindly, and looked confused and out of sorts. Blunderstone Rookery would come, however, in spite of her, when the carrier's horse pleased, and did. How well I recollect it, on a cold grey afternoon, with a dull sky threatening rain. The door opened and I looked, half laughing and half crying in my pleasant agitation for my mother. It was not she, but a strange servant. "Why, Peggotty," I said ruefully, "isn't she come home?" Yes, Master David," said Peggotty. "She's come home. Wait a bit, Master Davy, and I'll tell you something." Between her agitation and her natural awkwardness in getting out of the cart, Peggotty was making a most extraordinary festoon of herself, but I felt too blank and strained to tell her so. When she had got down, she took me by the hand and led me, wondering, into the kitchen and shut the door. "Peggotty," said I, quite frightened, "what's the matter?" "Nothing's the matter, bless you, Master Davy, dear," she answered, assuming an air of sprightliness. "Something's the matter, I'm sure. Where's Mamma?" "Where's Mamma, Master Davy?" repeated Peggotty. "Yes. Why hasn't she come out to the gate, and what have we come in here for? Oh, Peggotty!" My eyes were full, and I felt as if I were going to tumble down. "Bless the precious boy," cried Peggotty, taking hold of me. "What is it? Speak, my pet. Not dead too? Oh, she's not dead, Peggotty." Peggotty cried out, "No!" What an astonishing volume of voice, and then sat down and began to pant, and said I'd given her a turn. I gave her a hug to take away the turn, or to give her another turn in the right direction, and then stood before her, looking at her in anxious inquiry. "You see, dear, I should have told you before now," said Peggotty, "but I hadn't an opportunity. I ought to have made it, perhaps, but I couldn't." "Exactly." That was always a substitute for exactly, in Peggotty's militia of words. Bring my mind to it." Go on, Peggotty," said I, more frightened than before. "Master Davy," said Peggotty, untying her bonnet with a shaking hand, and speaking in a breathless sort of way, "what do you think? You have got a power." I trembled and turned white. Something, I don't know what, or how connected with the grave in the churchyard and the raising of the dead, seemed to strike me like an unwholesome wind. "A new one?" said Peggotty. "A new one?" I repeated. Peggotty gave a gasp, as if she were swallowing something that was very hard, and putting out her hand and said, "Come and see him." "I don't want to see him." "And your mamma?" said Peggotty. I ceased to draw back, and we went straight to the best parlour, where she left me. On one side of the fire sat my mother, on the other Mr. Murdstone. My mother dropped her work and arose hurriedly, but timidly, I thought. "Now, Clara, my dear," said Mr. Murdstone, "recollect, control yourself, always control yourself. Davy boy, how do you do?" I gave him my hand. After a moment of suspense, I went and kissed my mother. She kissed me, patted me gently on the shoulder, and sat down again to her work. I could not look at her. I could not look at him. I knew quite well that he was looking at us both. And I turned to the window and looked out there at some shrubs that were drooping their heads in the cold. As soon as I could creep away, I crept upstairs. My old dear bedroom was changed, and I was to lie a long way off. I rambled downstairs to find anything that was like itself, so altered it all seemed, and roamed into the yard. I very soon started back from there, for the empty dog kennel was filled up with a great dog, deep-mouthed and black-haired like him, and he was very angry at the sight of me, and sprang out to get at me. If the room to which my bed was removed were a sentient thing that could give evidence, I might appeal to it at this day. Who sleeps there now, I wonder, to bear witness for me what a heavy heart I carried to it? I went up there, hearing the dog in the yard bark after me all the way while I climbed the stairs, and looking as blank and strange upon the room as the room looked upon me, sat down with my small hands crossed and thought. I thought of the oddest things, of the shape of the room, of the cracks in the ceiling, of the paper on the walls, of the flaws in the window glass making ripples and dimples on the prospect of the washing stand being rickety on its 3 legs, and having a discontented something about it which reminded me of Mrs. Gummidge under the influence of the old one. I was crying all the time, but except that I was conscious of being cold and dejected, I'm sure I never thought why I cried. At last, in my desolation, I began to wonder that I was dreadfully in love with little Emily, and had been torn away from her to come here where no one seemed to want me or to care about me half as much as she did. This made such a very miserable piece of business of it, that I rolled myself up in a corner of the counterpane and cried myself to sleep. I was awoke by somebody saying, "Here he is," and uncovering my hot head. My mother and Peggotty had come to look for me, and it was one of them who had done it. "Davy," said my mother, "what's the matter?" I thought it was very strange that she should ask me, and answered nothing. I turned over on my face. I recollect to hide my trembling lip, which answered her with great truth. "Davy," said my mother, Davy, my child. I dare say no words she could have uttered would have affected me so much then as her calling me her child. I hid my tears in the bedclothes and pressed her from me with my hand when she would have raised me up. "This is your doing, Peggotty, you cruel thing," said my mother. "I have no doubt at all about it. How can you reconcile it to your conscience, I wonder, to prejudice my own boy against me, or against anybody who's dear to me? What do you mean by it, Peggotty?" Poor Peggotty lifted up her hands and eyes, and only answered in a sort of paraphrase of the grace I usually repeated after dinner. "Lord, forgive you, Mrs. Copperfield, and for what you've said this minute, may you never be truly sorry." "It's enough to distract me," cried my mother. "In my honeymoon, too, when my most inveterate enemy might relent, one who'd think and not envy me a little peace of mind and happiness. Davy, you naughty boy. Peggotty, you savage creature. Oh dear me," cried my mother, turning from one of us to the other in a pettish, wilful manner. "What a troublesome world this is, when one has the most right to expect it to be as agreeable as possible." I felt the touch of a hand that I knew was neither hers nor Peggotty, and slipped to my feet at the bedside. It was Mr. Murdstone's hand, and he kept it on my arm as he said, "What's this, Clara, my love? Have you forgotten? Firmness, my dear, firmness." "I am very sorry, Edward," said my mother. "I meant to be very good, but I am so uncomfortable." "Indeed," he answered. "That's a bad hearing so soon, Clara." "I say it's very hard I should be made so now," returned my mother, pouting. "And it is very hard, isn't it?" He drew her to him, whispered in her ear, and kissed her. I knew as well, when I saw my mother's head lean down upon his shoulder and her arm touch his neck, I knew as well that he could mould her pliant nature into any form he chose, as I know, now, that he did it. "Go you below, my love," said Mr. Murdstone. "David and I will come down together. My friend," turning a darkening face on Peggotty when he had watched my mother out and dismissed her with a nod and a smile, "do you know your mistress's name?" "She has been my mistress a long time, sir," answered Peggotty. "I ought to know it." "That's true," he answered. "But I thought I heard you as I came upstairs address her by a name that is not hers. She has taken mine, you know. Will you remember that?" Peggotty, with some uneasy glances at me, curtsied herself out of the room without replying, seeing, I suppose, that she was expected to go, and had no excuse for remaining. When we two were left alone, he shut the door, and sitting on a chair and holding me standing before him, looked steadily into my eyes. I felt my own attracted no less steadily to his, as I recall our being opposed thus face to face. I seem again to hear my heart beat fast and high. "David," he said, making his lips thin by pressing them together, "if I have an obstinate horse or a dog to deal with, what do you think I do?" "I don't know." "I beat him." I had answered in a kind of breathless whisper, but I felt in my silence that my breath was shorter now. I make him wince and smart. I say to myself, I'll conquer that fella. And if it were to cost him all the blood he had, I should do it. What is that upon your face? Dirt, I said. He knew it was the mark of tears as well as I. But if he had asked the question 20 times, each time with 20 blows, I believe my baby heart would have burst before I would have told him so. You have a good deal of intelligence for a little fella, he said, with a grave smile that belonged to him. And you understood me very well, I see. Wash that face, sir, and come down with me. Join me. Join me for the next video of David Copperfield. Join me to find out more about the life of David Copperfield. David Copperfield. Join me in the next video, Morel Bernard. I'll see you then. Okay, bye.